Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Welcome to wasmCloud Wednesday for Wednesday, December the 4th, the coldest wasmCloud Wednesday of the year for sure. We got a couple of fun demos and discussion items for today, but we actually have not new to the community or new to contributing to wasmCloud because Mark has been doing it for quite a while, but new to the community meeting. We have, I guess, somebody who is new to the community meeting. So Mark, would you like to do a quick intro about what you do, how you kind of found wasmCloud? I guess it's free time. You can do an intro however you'd like, but would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, all. So it's me, Mark, from Hungary, from Europe. It's pretty late here. So I was interested in WebAssembly and did find the project, I don't know, a year or 1.5 years ago. And I've been, I don't know, full stack developer. Currently, I'm an SRE for some reason. I don't know why. Been teaching in a bootcamp for like 7 years as well. Pretty interesting career things. And yeah, I've been looking at the technology. We are currently running in my workplace a bunch of containers, and I don't know, there are other ways to run applications, and that's what I'm here for.
Very cool. Yeah, you're in the right place. There may or may not be other ways to run applications than containers. Thanks for doing a little intro there, Mark. All right. Well, then, without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started? We have a couple of exciting things that kind of landed in the wasmCloud repository over the last week, and I want to show it off in a set of quick demos, and then we can definitely talk about it. I think there's a lot to discuss here. So, the first demo that I'm going to show is about our PR that landed last week called provider built-ins. We actually have just like we have native capability providers. It's been something we've been toying around with implementing for a while in the Wasm Cloud host is a built-in HTTP and messaging provider. So this is instead of spinning out a separate provider binary, we actually just delegate the listening on an HTTP port or listening for a NATS message to the Wasm Cloud host itself. And there's a couple of differences here. There's definitely some pros and cons, but I figure we might as well just see how it works and then we can talk about it from there. And then a little bit later into the demo, I'm going to pull up an OTel trace and then talk about what kind of changed there. So I've got my Wasm Cloud host locally. I'm just running this from main. This isn't actually out in a release quite yet, but it'll be coming in 1.5. And I've got kind of the incantations here, or to be more specific, the right environment variables to turn on tracing in the host. And then I'm also going to be enabling two experimental features for built-in HTTP and built-in messaging. So this is a kind of a behavior change going forward from 1.0. So we're enabling this with feature flags, which is actually something that's new to the host, but I have a feeling we'll be using fairly often because it's very useful to be able to turn these things on without making a breaking change. So I have a couple applications deployed. Let me go ahead and deploy my last one, Rust Hello World. And there is actually, if you've taken a look at the Hello World example for Wasm Cloud, this is going to look pretty similar with just one key difference. So here's our declarative manifest. I am loading my WebAssembly component locally from like my built component. If I go into examples, Rust components, hello world, I just ran wash build, that builds your component. But the one thing that is different is the HTTP server image reference is actually this special syntax for a Wasm Cloud built-in. So I can use this along with all of the other same configuration that we use for the native providers. And if I send a request to localhost 8000, you can see I get my hello from Rust. But the difference is there's not actually, if I take a look at the inventory of this host, sorry, let me scroll that over. This Rust Hello World HTTP server is actually not a separate thing that's running on the local host. So when you send an HTTP request to this built-in provider, it's received by the host. We directly call the components exported function, and then we return. So basically, what this gets rid of is the NATS hop between the capability provider and then the wasmCloud host. Now we can do the same thing for the messaging contract as well. Messaging or messaging interface. Now, if you haven't taken a look at this one, here's the actual component implementation for a messaging interface. So we have the single function called handle message. This is how you can invoke your component. It receives a message from a message broker or bus. And then if there is a request essentially to reply to this message, then we use the generated interface to publish a message back to the original requester. So this is just using the wasmCloud messaging interface, but we are implementing this for WASI messaging as well. And this manifest looks pretty similar. We have our one component, and then we have our built-in messaging NATS provider. So I can send a request to wasmCloud.echo, and I can say echo, and I'll get back my echo. Now, the difference between this and having a separate capability provider actually is really easy to visualize using a trace. So I want to kind of combine these two demos here, and I can send another request to this wasmcloud.echo.separate topic. This is actually running a capability provider. I have the old version of this, so there's like a separate provider. And I think light mode is going to come up, so warning for all the dark mode people. If we take a look at the difference of these two traces, you can see what is different from the services that are involved. So the built-in messaging provider here, the beginning of the trace is actually handling the message. So this is like the NATS message coming across and then hitting the host. Then we call handle message on the WebAssembly component. And then you can see it going out the other end to publish the message back to the original requester. So this is a trace that basically shows how the built-in works. You can see everything's running in debug mode, so I wouldn't take these numbers 100%, but you can see that the separate NATS, or I wouldn't take these numbers as like definitive how long it takes, just because tracing introduces an overhead. But you can see with the separate NATS messaging provider, you can see we have two services. The entry point is actually at the provider level, and then we dispatch that message over to the host. You can see we have a little bit of, this is essentially the cost of the round trip to make it to the host. Then we instantiate the component, call handle message, the same function as before. And then on the other end, when we publish a message, we actually go back out to that same NATS messaging provider. So I thought it was super cool to visualize the difference between the built-in and then kind of the host binary plugin using the trace, because you can see the different services. You can also see the difference in time and how long it takes to actually, invoke something using this. And some of the fixes that we recently put into the host were to get this proper trace hierarchy set up so that when you actually, everything kind of rolls up under this root span, which is the start of the trace, and then you can follow that tree down the, kind of the invocation hierarchy. So there are some tracing fixes that have gone into the host to make this all look nice and pretty. But huge kudos to all the folks who were working on this last week, because it's definitely a lot nicer now. The traces really help kind of visualize the built-in things, but I think the biggest benefit of the built-in is the performance side. I don't have any super hard numbers here actually, but you can see, just as a heuristic, that the difference between making a request through the separate provider and then going back and then making the request through the built-in is certainly noticeable, on the level of microseconds versus milliseconds to say a bit. And this is really just to say that anytime you're going back and forth between a, wasmCloud host to wasmCloud host or, capability provider, you are going to do a hop, an RPC hop. And so eliminating a network hop turns out is faster. Probably not any news there for folks. But we did want to make sure that for some of the common cases like incoming HTTP, eventually outgoing HTTP, doing messaging, we should seek to optimize those where we can. And yeah, exactly, to your point, you also skip downloading the provider binary, you skip executing the provider binary and kind of having the separate entity in your deployment footprint. It does just greatly simplify the default case. Now, I will mention essentially the reason why we haven't done this, why we didn't do this already, and potential downside to using this is that building in the provider into the Wasm Cloud host means if we want to ship a new version of the HTTP server, or if there was like a security patch for the HTTP library we use, we need to ship a new version of the host rather than a new version of the separate plugin. That is certainly, yep, Florian, sounds like we're talking about the same thing. That is certainly something to think about when deploying this. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't, at the platform level, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't need to deploy the HTTP service, whether it's the separate plugin or the host again. But that is one reason why we are sticking with this as an option and not essentially a requirement or something that you can't build in, because in the case where you're making use of a built-in and you need to bring on a security patch and you can't redeploy the host immediately, you can deploy that binary provider again and then essentially get the updated version of the patch. So there's nothing, there's nothing that is preventing you from just doing it the same way with the dynamic plugins. I think it really just comes down to your use case and what's most important for what you're trying to do. If you're really trying to optimize the performance bit and or want to minimize your deployment footprint, the built-in is a great option. If you are really optimizing for the separation, the patchability of these individual providers, then you can still take advantage of the same binary, or sorry, same model that you're using today. So it's all about the choice. There's certainly some things that we've gone through with testing, or there's certainly more to do with testing the built-ins and making sure they work for all the right use cases. We could have a way to turn them off if there was a security vulnerability, things like that. But that's why why we're disabling them by default and essentially making them enabled by a feature flag. So, I think that the demo is probably not super exciting because it's the same functionality, but it certainly is nicer to have something that's faster and easier to deploy. We may consider building this into Wash Dev for like the built-in, for like our default providers, because why not? They're already there. But I wanted to give some idea of the pros and the cons. Let's see, Florian, I want to make sure that I addressed your question there in the chat, but do folks have any questions here?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Hi, I'm Jan. Um, we usually in our use cases we need the guarantees a Nets consumer provides, and that's not in the messaging in the usual messaging library, not in the one that goes into the host, right? So we would actually always, beyond the Hello World examples, use a custom provider, and so that just adds a little bit to the kind of deployed code, I would say, right? To the heaviness of the host itself, for us at least, right? But I see absolutely the use case for really hello world and easy use cases, but for anything that relies on quality of service guarantees, it might be more added than replacement, so to speak, right?
Yeah. And I think we certainly considered that for someone who is only using, custom interfaces or custom implementations, like basically if you're not relying only on HTTP and messaging, this is essentially just something you wouldn't use. Um, and I think that's fine, but it is great feedback that that essentially just adds to the actual host deployment. Since we're doing a release, or I mean, we'll cut this initially as a release candidate. I would be really interested to compare the like binary size of the host and then the like runtime footprint one to the other because even if we can disable it at runtime, the dependencies and code is still in there. I would want to make sure that that change was pretty minimal.
Yeah. Could be battery included versus you could, I mean, you could also say you enable it kind of in a build, so you don't have to package it with the host if you don't need it, right? Kind of you can leave it out, reducing the security footprint. So if that has a security issue, so you just lower the footprint all along, right?
Yeah. So like
But
a
certainly
min
a welcome feature. I'm not saying this is not. This is very useful for people that out of the box want to have it work in a very performant way, right?
Yeah. No, and I'm really glad that you were here to voice that because like you all are deploying wasmCloud on a like more constrained like edge device. And it can be easy to like uh it can be easy to think in a cloud where you're like deploying it onto a container. It's like, all right, it'll just take a couple more megabytes, but that can make a big difference when
Mm.
wasmCloud hits the middle. Yeah, I think Bailey probably has thoughts here. Well, maybe a lot of people have thoughts here. I think a like minimal distribution of the Wasm Cloud host, like a Wasm Cloud Lite, is something that we've certainly thought about. It's not like there's been a ton that we could exclude from it, but this would certainly be something we could exclude from that deployment.
Mm. Yeah, right now there's not much to exclude. It's core basically right now, right? And then you have certain kind of batteries included version or so, right?
Yeah,
It's not light. I mean, it's just the core thing. It's just what Wasm Cloud is good at the core, right?
yeah, and there's various optimizations and things that we can do. Um, to consider like a more lightweight Wasm time host too. Um, because when we distribute Wasm Cloud, we have to do it with the most general case in mind. Like we have no idea if you're going to run one component and just optimize for just that one, all over the place, or
Hmm.
1,000 components only in one place. It's very um, I mean, it is a platform, so it's not specifically designed for one use case.
And I think that's great. That's not a bad thing, right? It's like Kubernetes doesn't specialize necessarily out of the box to a certain use case, right? Only on the edge, only there and here. So it's a general purpose tool platform, right? And that's good.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think we do a pretty good job of being extensible in a lot of ways. I mean, totally custom interfaces, custom implementations are really nice for doing that. So I want to make sure that we're being really careful about not being overly prescriptive for how people are going to run their things. So when we cut our 1.5 release candidate, I'll make sure that we compare binary size like um, runtime footprint, especially if runtime footprint if the feature flags are disabled, and then runtime footprint like the built-in host HTTP, for example, versus the host and the separate HTTP. Because that would be really interesting. The deployment footprint could get smaller depending on what you're doing there. And then I would love to consider ways with capability providers to, I'd like to consider a lot of things with capability providers, but to better optimize for your case too, because the custom implementation is the most common use case. So making sure that we can kind of scale that separately and optimize that would be really good too. Yeah, many thoughts, many
Um,
thoughts.
yeah, I don't want to take up too much airtime, but it's there. If you call the component directly, right? The handler basically, instead of going through RPC. Isn't that a model that you want to enable kind of on a kind of more modular thing? I want to have a capability provider that doesn't do that calls that directly as well, right? To get that performance benefit, to skip the NATS part of it.
Yeah, right. And I think that that is what's so inspiring about WRPC being something where the transport is pluggable. Like there's an implementation for WRPC for NATS, for TCP, for Quick. I believe also
Okay.
using domain sockets. So not even stepping outside of the bound, like outside of WRPC, like our core of how RPC works, we can use a different, and this is assuming both sides know, but use a different protocol to have the provider and the component communicate. And so you may be able to
Hmm.
maybe not skip the hop in like a pure service to service standpoint, but like skip a NAT hop, or if you could push a message over Unix domain sockets, which we've
That's
definitely
super
thought
fast.
about, and then decide, that's something that's specific to Unix things. So if you're going to run on Windows, of course, we can't only do that, but like I said, generic things. But those are the kind of things that we're thinking about,
Hmm.
because that would be great.
Cool.
I know on the ever looming horizon, there's always been the idea of like WebAssembly providers too, which would be pretty cool to keep that all on the same host, and do that communication. But there is actually, I believe, I forget if they are a master's student or a PhD student, but they're working through on the wasmCloud Slack right now, bypassing the like a component to component call. So doing that locally within the host if everything is running in the same place, which I think would be another great kind of feature flag to turn on. I have more thoughts there, but I'll leave it at that maybe for now. It's really cool. Wow. Okay, great. Folks have any other questions or comments on the built-ins and the tracing bits? Alrighty. Well then I think we have some fun discussion to do next. One thing that we added into the host in order to make this work, we went back and forth adding the built-in HTTP and messaging providers. They're additive, non-breaking changes, so we can kind of roll those forward in a minor release, and it doesn't change anything about the way that you would run wasmCloud now. You just kind of can opt into the built-in providers if you'd like. However, there is a little bit of an aspect of like maybe we don't want these to be on by default. You should be able to turn them off at the very least. And since they're new features, we've been talking for quite a long time about feature flags in the Wasm Cloud host, so being able to turn on certain things when you actually just run the host. We kind of already do this in some of our command line flags, like disabling the latest tag for OCI or allowing loading components and providers from files. All of these things, we essentially made the choice to keep the security features on by default. So, keeping that deny by default model. But for these, we kind of went with a little bit of a way to move into the future with feature flags. And I'm not sure if you saw it when I started the wasmCloud host, but these two features, built-in HTTP and built-in messaging, are the first and only two that started with this. Now, this is great for enabling or disabling things when you actually run the host. But I know that first of all, this hasn't actually released in wasmCloud yet, so completely happy to change. But I wanted to open this up for discussion in the call to talk about feature flags and the way that we want to enable or disable these kinds of this kind of functionality. Bailey, I know that you had some thoughts here and wanted to talk about it. Maybe you had some different ideas. So
Yeah, so
I'll give it to you to start.
I think what we have right now is really good, and it let us try out this built-in provider feature. And it matches really well when you look at like the way that you would do feature flagging, like let's say with Rust, where in your cargo toml you do comma, all these features. But I kind of wanted to explore talking about it from what it would look like for an application to expose feature flags and how that would also be reflected in, like, let's say a WDAM deployment. We know for certain about features in that it's like, hey, how did we end up with CrowdStrike or some of these other things? It's always a config change. And what are feature flags but like config changes by another name that allows other code paths to execute. And often it's the combination of feature flags that can cause some pretty interesting behavior in different types of systems. I think there's a few things that maybe we could go and think about from a design perspective. I know actually Jonas has, highlighted how cool and helpful the feature gates are of Kubernetes. And, something else that I'm, a little bit interested in right now and learning a little bit more about is like open features, that CNCF project. And it would be cool if we could answer it from how should wasmCloud, the platform, expose feature flags for itself? And how should applications themselves expose feature flags? And I don't have an answer here. I thought that was probably an interesting topic that might be fun to talk about.
So I'm not actually super familiar with the feature gates thing in Kubernetes. I can imagine, I just Googled it and I can imagine kind of how it works.
Is it like feature flippers? Just that's the general idea.
Yeah, I guess that was going to be my question. How do the feature gates kind of work and what makes them good or bad?
Yeah, so the general idea in Kubernetes is that new experimental features or things that are being proposed into the project as an addition are generally added behind what they call a feature gate. And so there's a page with, I don't know, if maybe like 50 to 100 different feature gates now. And over different releases, as the project matures, as the feature itself matures, it goes through sort of a criteria of starting out as alpha when it's introduced, and which usually means that it gets defaulted to be off. And in order to make use of that feature, you actually have to turn on or specify that feature gate when you start kubelet, or if it's a Kubernetes scheduling feature, then you'll have to specify that as part of the scheduler when you start the scheduler API server or whatnot. So either control plane or kubelet, you'll have to specify that feature gate to be turned on. And that's when it will get enabled. Then as the project or as the feature matures, it'll eventually make its way into a beta stage, usually at which point it'll get enabled to true or defaulted to true. And then the goal is to basically move it to I think it's I forget if it's a graduated stage or what the last one is, but once it basically gets out of the, it might not actually.
Release
GA,
maybe?
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
GA.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
so
they
once it
often
makes
don't
it to
make
GA, yeah, they get removed. So this is a way to basically experiment with new features without making them a requirement for everybody. It's a way to introduce an idea try it out and give people who are really interested in actually using that or driving that. And you'll see, like, for example, API list chunking had 3 different versions that it went through, 3 different stages that it went through, listed out there. And it was in beta for a really long time. Like that's like, what, 5 years or something like that, 6 years. So this is just a way to basically introduce a feature to the platform, make it available, let people who really are interested in that feature try it out and use it. And then if it turns out to be a good idea, it'll eventually graduate through beta to GA. And once it gets to GA, they'll just remove the flag feature gate, so it's on by default. Or rather, there's no way to disable it. But if it's in beta, you can still disable it if it's a problematic thing. So the idea is that you have control, whether it's in alpha or beta stage, you can have control to say, like, I don't want this feature, I do want this feature. When it makes it to GA, basically the project has decided that this is a good feature to carry forward as part of the platform.
I gotta go.
And so it's a really nice way to introduce experimental capabilities that may not make sense for everybody, and
Hey,
try out ideas.
Jonas, just real quick, Jonas, this is part of like the plan you have to, where you'd have a control plane, I'm guessing. That kind of, this comes after that, but I do have to go, but yeah.
Yeah, so this would be, I mean, control plane for certainly, but also this is actually for the kubelet itself. A lot of these gates are
Oh,
in
I
the
just meant for
kubelet.
wasmCloud, when you bring it to wasmCloud.
Yes, I think we would want a control plane coupled with this as well, so that, because some of these would be control plane level things. Like there might be coordination between the control plane and the host itself in terms of like whether or not something should be used. Yeah, for sure.
All right, awesome. Thanks.
But it's basically a way to introduce new APIs to the project without like creating a breaking change. Because as you've noticed, Kubernetes hasn't changed their major versions since the project made it to 1.0, which is a choice. So their way to guard against that breaking changes is to basically use feature gates. So they don't introduce something as a GA feature that would be quote unquote breaking change. Rather, they use feature gates and essentially guarantee that whenever they are ready to put something in as part of the core project and does not create a breaking change, it'll graduate to GA. And so, as you can see from that page, not a lot of features have made it to GA, but a lot of them are in a beta stage, and they're effectively treated as GA. So it's kind of silly in that way. But I think it's a really good idea. It allows you to experiment with stuff. Some things stay in alpha for a really long time. And that's okay, because the people that are still using those features can make use of those features without being locked in, like without like causing everybody else in the community to have to use it. Because the footprint is for Kubernetes is pretty massive, as folks might know.
And not that I want necessarily our footprint to be massive, but I definitely want our usage to be. And I think out of the examples in the greater ecosystem, I think Kubernetes really has found something that works really well. And I love how it's like a top level, like this is the platform view. Here are all of my features for that view. I love that it has the process of like, okay, when I move from alpha to beta, I become enabled by default. And we get to roll with that for a little while. And then I think we could, do better, and that we could maybe close the gap between how long it's in beta and going GA for us. We're a smaller project, so we should be able to do that. And yeah, just thinking about it from beyond just like a host feature thing and more about like a wasmCloud feature thing is what I thought was interesting.
Letting that marinate a little bit. I really love the idea of extending this idea to be more than just like, here's this very specific thing we're going to turn on in the host. Like Colin thinking forward to like, Wasm is basically our control plane as it is now. What kind of features could we enable at the like Wasm control plane layer? Yeah, he gone, but maybe he'll watch this later. And hey Colin, if you're watching this, don't say anything or whatever. And then Bailey, you also are talking to not just things that you turn on at the kubelet or well, whatever, the wasmCloud platform layer, there's also like the idea of something that you would turn on dynamically for a deployment. So like you deploy an application and maybe that application exposes a feature or it turns a specific feature on. That seems like some dragons are there. If you're changing something on the platform for an app, I'm not saying that you were proposing that. I'm basically thinking out loud right now. But I do really love the idea of taking this and turning that into like the docs page, or turning it into a docs page that we have on wasmCloud. We could start with this. We can say, hey, built-in HTTP and messaging are alpha level features or beta level features, whatever we want to say. And you just have to enable it.
Yeah, a little bit. I have a few more thoughts on that, and I've definitely jammed on them a little bit with just Jonas so far. So I wanted to start the discussion here. I think that we should differentiate between things that are features for the platform and then features that applications running on the platform expose. And hey, you could totally steal our idea because technically the CFP hasn't closed yet. But we wanted to be motivated to enter a CFP that explored using open features for WASM applications. There's obviously a way to do it pretty simply with their HTTP client, like that's pretty understood. But I think there's probably some pretty interesting things that we could do when we look at the space in a WIT and WASM native way. And I would love it if we, the wasmCloud project was like, hey, we kind of think this is probably a best practice for how to structure your applications, evolve them over time, that kind of thing. So I feel like, I guess the only reason why it's coming up here is I just want to make sure that we separate those because I think they're very different contexts and domains and the way that we'd approach it.
Well, for applications, it would be more like a built-in provider, right? What we just talked about. Like you have a launch darkly flag provider, open feature, and we have launch darkly, right? We use it extensively to roll out our app. So we could just say, okay, we use the launch darkly provider for that, right? For the open feature backend.
Exactly, yeah, because it's not just components, it would also be for providers, and I feel like that might be a really cool ecosystem to lean into. I guess maybe if you can answer it, are you using it from GitLab's built in for launch darkly? Okay, I just know a lot of people are, and I'm like, oh wow, so we just like plug right into a whole ecosystem deployment, and it would just work TM for a whole bunch of people out there. Okay, just curious. So I guess I'm not asking for action right now. I just think, we've learned a lot over the past year. Like what's happened, right? We hit wasmCloud 1.0. To do that, we were like, okay, we're gonna go from a world where everything is an API and everything is a module. And starting only in January 24th, I think is when I held the vote for the WASI subgroup to launch WASI.2. Only now can all these language ecosystems start to, be able to start supporting and compiling to components. And then we had to make an entire ecosystem go to make that real, right? And I think we've learned a lot over the past year, and we've seen a ton of adoption. And so we've seen some really cool patterns emerge, right? I call it the platform harness pattern, where somebody writes their business logic, and then they compose with a component that's built from the platform team. It composes with it. Now, Luke Wagner, who's one of the co-creators of WebAssembly and creator of the component model, who he calls these donuts. So another fun name for that, but essentially a type of component that wraps another component. And the benefit of that is that you can update that independent of the business logic component, and you can have this platform component understand about all the things that the platform engineering team provides for the other people running on top of them. And so That's just another area that I think is exciting and cool, and I want to like think about, okay, if this is the pattern that a lot of people are doing to run on wasmCloud, how do we facilitate it? How do we make platform better for that type of use case? So I think there's a lot of opportunities. December is usually the time for people to kind of go back and think deeply about how things went, retro, hack a little bit. And so, yeah, I hope our community has the opportunity to do that this month. Masood?
Okay, so I want to kind of point to a different topic, but bring it to this. And Brooks, this is what we discussed last week about provenance and trust, because I did look into some areas. And when I'm looking at this and that, and then secrets and so on and so forth, I think we might all benefit from thinking about a framework, whatever that might look like. Maybe you know already or you don't. But what I'm saying is that thinking about a framework about how we dress up the platform and extend it with different capabilities, call them feature or whatever, because I'm not mentioning like flags here. I'm just talking about how we extend it and then let people, for example, somebody saying that in my environment, I don't need secrets or security. I don't need trust because of, I'm running in a home lab, or I'm blah, blah corp, and provenance is utmost, important to us. And, so I'm saying that like we're kind of, I'm feeling the conversations are kind of quantized into different topics and how they tie together to say that how holistically the platform gets extended or stripped down would be beneficial for everybody to consider.
I'm just thinking about that one too, letting it. Right. So not, I mean, probably a big barrier to entry for which I'm not saying it should be or not, and probably a separate conversation, but a decent barrier to entry to some of these additional layers on the platform is the ability to get in and get your hands dirty on like implement that in the host. But we could do more than that. Like as you're working on the provenance and trust thing, like how do you get that into wasmCloud? Like does it have to be a separate thing that you run, or could it just be another feature, whatever, that's a part of the platform? Am I on the wrong track here, Masood?
So let me say one thing in that regard. So when it comes to that topic, right? What is the bottom turtle? The SPF thing that they used to say, and now they have stopped in the past 2 years. Now that everybody knows about them. But what is the bottom turtle? If we say that I need Wash, for example, to install the platform, and somebody says that, how do I trust Wash, for example, right? Then that brings up that question of what is the bottom turtle? Or we say that, okay, that is the base of the trust and we built on it. And that's why I'm saying that it kind of ties into this bigger topic of, and Jonas, it's not only about interfaces. It's about core of the system. That's what I'm talking about. And I'm saying that how we kind of put layers on top of the minimal host and give it different capabilities, or which people can use or not, right? And then that can go in all sorts of different ways, and people can contribute to say that how we extend the capabilities of the platform without really breaking things.
Yeah, I would venture to say that a good bit of what we offer as a part of the platform now we could reclassify under that kind of additional layer model. Like you use the example of secrets. Secrets could be something that you turn on or off and just skip the instantiation or checking, which we basically do, but having that more formalized and not just like one-off examples, I think would be really well and would really help define like what is the minimal wasmCloud platform. I mean, I
And
think
that was what I was thinking about, that aspect. Is it that let's say we built or I built a custom config server when it comes to such topics, or something more custom, let's say like the secrets binary that we say we purpose for that matter and so on, but saying that this is kind of the guidelines from the project that says, within these boundaries we work. We do know, at least I know, the provider and what we can do with the providers, but not everything could fit into the provider model.
I think, yeah, +1 there. And then also, I think what we're sort of saying is that we see this platform growing, right? Like we're starting to hit the right beats. So how do we architect it in a way that it allows us to have this level of extensibility for each part of the architecture of the platform? Because we know not everything necessarily will fit in the provider model. We know not everything's going to be a built-in. We've got policy, but that fella could use some love, some time, love, and care. But I think there's a lot of aspects across the wasmCloud platform, and I think we could, by thinking about it from this feature gate perspective, from the way to identify exactly what we have. So let me give a different example. Right now, our host is managing the provider. And I think we have a lot of opportunities to talk about like how if we introduced a control plane idea, which we've talked about before, how these can be different extension points within that control plane. As opposed to everything being put in the host, which we said is pretty minimal. It could be smaller. We could do more there.
I mean, yeah, it could be smaller. Like if you think of like I don't know, I feel like the base of wasmCloud is like we've run WebAssembly. Like that one's got to be there. We're not taking that part out because then it's just cloud, right? And there's already cloud. So then what are the layers on top of that? Built-ins, plugins, secrets, config, policy, registry, like, yeah. I'm just listing features of wasmCloud, I guess. Liam, save me.
Look, I think we should always align our strategy to the facts on the ground, and when we launched wasmCloud, Brooks, I mean, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, like time is like a blur anymore, or the precursor what became now wasmCloud. The world was a completely different place. We didn't have we had our own version of the component model, like as a vision. Now we have the component model. We had our own way to do plugins. Now we have WRPC. WasmTime didn't have a way. We didn't even use WasmTime to begin with. Never mind WasmTime having the ability to do plugins, which also uses WRPC. So I think that we should never be afraid to challenge all of our assumptions. Now, conceptually, the original idea was, even in the Rust implementation of wasmCloud that we have now, was to build a library that you could import in. But I personally don't believe that is really feasible, that there's too much tight coupling now between the wasmCloud host and the underlying crates that are underneath it there. There is, I think the project is really well organized. We know we've had it security audited, so we know that it's, structured really well. But there is, I think, too tight of a coupling between a lot of those things. And I know a lot of people are thinking about this, and a lot of people have some ideas, and maybe even some whiteboard sketches or drafts or tests or things like that. So I'm always open to making room for those kind of experiments as we think ahead to maybe some future wasmCloud 2.0 or maybe something along those lines to get out there. And I think it'll be Bailey's leadership here in helping us to architect this in a way that will serve the future standards proposals. WASI wasn't a thing when we started. The WebAssembly component model, WASI 2.2 wasn't a thing. Never mind 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4. But of course, Bailey will engage the whole community, because that's where the magic of this ecosystem has come from. Thank you, Bill. That's where I was going with that around around the design. We've always really intentionally done quarterly road mapping as a community. That's not a wasmCloud organizers thing. We've always, my view is always that the people on this call, Jochen, for example, this is as much your project as it is mine. You guys contribute, you guys go on stage and talk about it. We go on stage and talk about it. It's all of our project. This is our community. So I look for an opportunity to get more people involved as organizers, more people involved as maintainers. God knows we need it. You guys, you're all on the Slack. You can see how many new people keep showing up. And frankly, I think it's awesome because half the time I don't even know who's answering the questions. It's not somebody on my payroll, which I love. So, to be a little tactical there. But what that means is the community is like self-organizing and self-satisfying. So, so I really like that. And, I think I'm always open to whichever the direction the community decides we should move in, us doing that. And I think a lot of us are starting to think the same way, as we found a real scalable niche around platform engineering and what does it mean to sort of optimize a bit more for this use case and think through those jobs to be done a little bit more crisply. Brooks, was that enough of a lifeline?
Yeah, love it.
Certainly, I've talked over. Nobody remembers what the question was.
Yeah, I actually don't. But I will say that yeah, definitely +1 on community making this better. I think I've already gushed too much about it in previous community calls. It is so wonderful to see somebody new come in, and then someone like Mark or Masood, you guys swing in and say, "Oh yeah, I ran into that," or here's the person pointing them at the people on the maintainer team too. Here's the person you should talk to for that. It's huge. That always makes my day when I see stuff like that. All right. Well, I'm certainly fine with continuing with a little kumbaya, community, great. But I think that I guess, yeah, Bailey, just to tie that, Bailey, Jonas, everybody, just to tie that one around. I really like the idea of using these features, maybe aggressively is the wrong word, but as a more formal way to introduce new functionality into the host. And even maybe reclassify some of the things that we already have as features that are turned on by default, now that we've released them and everything. Because I think that there are significant, really awesome changes that are going to come to wasmCloud that is going to push us to a 2.0. And I don't want it to be something small, I guess, something that we can gate back with a feature flag. I'm thinking like WASI P3, I'm thinking like, pluggable transports, all kinds of really interesting stuff that we'll want to deprecate things that we know from running 1.0 for over a year in various levels of production, that we want to make better, making that breaking change really intentionally over something we can introduce with features. So I'm glad we have this. I'm really interested to look more into open feature 2 is a way to enable this, since once we are past like the very simple case, that's not just, hey, turn this small thing on. That would be really cool to get integrated. All right, folks. Well, we're just about at time here. All right, Masood, you get the last section.
I have one question that has stumped me since weekend. The test containers, or rather integration tests, do they run successfully? I have written one for the blob store, NATS blob store, and it's quite massive. And I'm running it, and I get a lot of WRPC synchronous call error or something, which doesn't make sense because it's not supposed to be that way. And I'm wondering if it's something that I'm missing, or there is a problem and I should not be spending too much time trying to get it work.
The integration test should pass successfully. They have been flaky in the past, like in CI. So it's certainly possible that you're running into something that's not your issue. But if you didn't make a change, were you talking about integration tests for the hosts that run, or your integration tests?
No, so I used the integration test that was written for Azure Blob Store provider, and I changed it for NATS. I cleaned it up. I added additional tests. It appears that the one for Azure, which quite understandable, people got exhausted, and there are some of the things that need to be cleaned up. There are some edge cases that actually the other providers don't support. I'm going to do them later through a maintenance PR because I know exactly where they are and what they are. But in general, I was trying to make sure that all integration tests can run before I submit the PR. And as I said, since weekend, I've been trying to get the integration testing working. And today I'm contemplating that if I can't get it to work today, I'm going to just write a straight component that tests all functions. Right?
Okay. Yeah, I would encourage, here's my perspective. I would encourage you to drop maybe what's failing in the integration test in Slack. Maybe we could do a quick back and forth debug and see if it's something that seems reasonable to that might be failing on our side, or something that's wrong with our testing setup. But you've already done so much work in getting the provider written, getting the integration test set up. So I wouldn't shy away from, or sorry, I would encourage you also to open a draft PR. If the integration test is failing, then that's something that I could check out locally and then run the integration test as well. But I guess in the meantime, what one of us can do is validate that the Azure integration tests are working too, because then that would help. Does that make sense? I just don't want you to have to go write
No,
a whole.
again, because I have tested some of the functions, not all of the functions, an integration test would give me the confidence that everything is working as expected. Again, as I said, if it doesn't work, I'm going to add a component. It doesn't take much time, it's 20 minutes to test all functions. And then based on that, making sure that the provider has no bugs, I issue the PR with the integration test, and then we can kind of iterate over it, and if there are things that could be rectified. I know that the provider is running, provider is running, is connecting, is receiving messages, but anything that runs gets an WRPC synchronous call error. And so that's why I'm saying that I'm not going to hold up much longer issuing that PR. I just wanted to know that if something is really missing there, not wasting more time trying to figure out what's wrong with the integration test setup.
I think this does sound pretty reminiscent of an issue that we ran into when we were doing integration testing, where there's a struct in the provider SDK that's like a global variable. And normally you're just running one provider, it's not an issue, but I think it might share that global variable with WRPC. And in that case, that might cause you problems during the integration test.
I'll post, as you suggested, I'll post the error message. And again, if you say that, okay, just leave it, then I do the component to test and then issue the PR.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, let's take a look at that error message and then figure out what's left. All right, folks. Well, then that runs us right up to about an hour. Thank you so much for coming to the community meeting this week. This is a good one. Lots of good discussions and everything. I'm glad people are getting some time to think about how we can make wasmCloud better in the new year as things slow down for this one. So, all right, everybody. Well, have a great rest of your day and week, and we'll see you next week.